We might have some things to catch up a little bit last time. So I wanted to ask, first of all, I couldn't remember. Did we talk about the commodity form? We did not. Oh my God. Okay, so that was, okay, so there is actually a kind of sequence here with the 3 weeks of Baudelaire. So the first week of Benjamin on Baudelaire is on the Marx dimension. And we talked a great deal about the history, the political history, the moment. This week we're going to sort of add Freud into the mix a little bit, as well as revisit some things we've talked about previously, like Proust. And then next week we will sort of kind of wrap up the entirety of our discussion. But last week, one of the things that we did not do, so we did history. We didn't do what we might call the logical aspect of the Marxist dimension to Benjamin on Baudelaire. Okay, so, to wit, if you recall, he says, here it is the commodity itself that speaks. Here it is the commodity itself that speaks, in Baudelaire's writing, in Baudelaire's poetry in particular. Poetry's, not his critical writings, less so the poetry. Now, to say that is to say something very specific, because lyric poetry, Baudelaire is a lyric poet. He's not an epic poet, he's a lyric poet. What that means is that the lyricism, that means the voice of the individual. So to say that the voice of the individual is speaking the voice of the commodity is to say that the individual has become a commodity. So there's a passage from Marx that is appropriate here. We're going to look at a couple of things from Marx, but let's look at
Yeah, so when we talk about lyric poet and like the voice of the individual,
yes.
do we project here this dichotomy of epic and dramatic theater that was
No. No, this would be a little different. So the reason that's different, it's more related to something that we talked about with Lukács, with the novel form. And how the novel is different from epic narrative. It's somewhat related, but a little bit different, because what Brecht was trying to do is restore the possibilities of drama, and in either case with tragedy or comedy. It is about the situation. So if you recall, that's the category of the situation. Meaning the characters, the protagonists, they're either in a cosmic situation of divine fate and various forces affecting the universe, or they're in a social political situation. So tragedy is about the sort of divine cosmic situation, and comedy is about the social political situation. So I mentioned that Shakespeare combines these, like raises the level of social and political situation to that of cosmic fate. We read Fate and Character, the short piece, but I don't think that we talked about it. But you know, in epic forms, the fate of the individual or the character, because it's not really an individual, it's a character. The fate of the character is sort of pre-given. Whereas in bourgeois society, in bourgeois art, the point is that we're figuring it out. We're figuring out our fate, we're figuring out our character, we're figuring out who we are. So the novel form, because that's really the template according to which Benjamin is understanding various things. He's understanding it in terms of literature, in terms of literary form, and especially narrative literature. The two narrative forms, the story of the tribe versus the story of the individual. The story of the tribe is the epic. The story of the individual is the novel. So the epic is about how the community came to be what it is. And the novel is about how the individual came to be what they are, who they are. Right? So epics are about like great historic events and these kinds of things. And novels are about individual life. Right? The Bildungsroman as the paradigmatic example, namely how the character, how the protagonist came to be who they are. Right? So the apprenticeship of Wilhelm Meister was like the perfect exemplar for Lukács and therefore also for Benjamin. Okay, so lyric poetry, epic poetry, lyric poetry. Epic poetry is similarly the voice of the community. And lyric poetry is the voice of the individual. Now, again, Shakespeare, comedy, tragedy, bourgeois, transformation of these genres in the modern era. The subject is not divine faith, the subject is freedom. The freedom of the individual to choose their own fate, which again is inseparable from their character, meaning they choose their fate. Nietzsche, so I always am invoking Nietzsche, the fact that Benjamin, before he was Marxist, he was a Nietzschean. And Nietzsche's great phrase at an ethical level is amor fati, love your fate, meaning you have one life to live, that's it, YOLO, right? And so whatever course your life takes, embrace it, love it, because after all, that's all you got. That's who you are. That's all you got. Right? So, again, the fact that you might create your own destiny. And also, I was just teaching this in my other course, The Philosophy of Modernism. We were reading Nietzsche on Wagner, and also Adorno's response to Nietzsche on Wagner. What if our fate, what if our divine fate is to be free? What if freedom is our fate? Yeah. Because after all, everything that the ancients said was the will of the gods was actually done by humans. So Hegel famously said that religion is the first recognition of freedom. Because religion is the first thing that tells us not to act according to our biological instinct. Meaning, we're free. We don't just act on instinct, we're free. So humans have known this for tens of thousands of years, that we're free. And so how did we recognize our freedom? By alienating it, by externalizing it in the form of the will of the gods. So we're not the puppet strings of nature. We're not on the puppet strings of nature, marionettes of nature. We're on the puppet strings, we're marionettes of the gods. But in fact, everything that we think the gods will for us is what we are willing for ourselves. Do you know the story? Moses, the Pharaoh, Exodus? Yeah? So Moses goes to the Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And the Pharaoh is like, maybe I should let them go. But then God hardens the heart of the Pharaoh and prevents the Pharaoh from letting them go? Oh, yeah. Why? Why? Especially because Moses has got to fight for his freedom. So if the Pharaoh was like, you know what, Moses, you're right, letting you go, then somehow Moses wouldn't have been free. Because his freedom would have been the will of the Pharaoh, not his own.
But that was the Pharaoh's free will.
But no, it wasn't, because his heart was hardened, right? It was like he was going to, and then it was like, nah. And then, of course, we know the Pharaoh, he couldn't let it go. Like, he chased Moses into the Red Sea and got destroyed. Yes? And you know the Pharaoh was the but the adopted brother of Moses. Because Moses was the adopted son of the Pharaoh, but of the father of the Pharaoh. Right? So it's like pretty Cain and Abel-y. You know, it's like the two brothers. Because the Pharaoh was like, Moses, I grew up with you. What do you do with these Jews? What are you talking about? These slaves? What? Yeah, we grew up in the palace together, remember? And Moses is like, no. Because Moses heard from God. No, Moses had a trip. The burning bush was tripping. There were many people tripped in the desert. Heard the voice of God. I think they still do that. Or whatever. No, it's our will. It's our freedom. That's the point. Okay, so lyric poetry. The difference between poetry and lyric poetry, especially, and the novel. Here's another Lukácsism. So, time is a character. Did we talk about this? I don't know if we talked about this. So Lukács' theory of the novel. In the epic, time is not a character. That's why you can read the Old Testament and it can be like hundreds of years past, or so-and-so begot so-and-so begot so-and-so, or like generation after generation. It's like reading a Tolkien, like the Silmarillion or something. Do you guys know J.R. Tolkien? Lord of the Rings? Like,
In novel, time's a character?
time is a character in the novel, meaning it thematizes time in a way that the epic does not. The epic is just things happen. And there's no temporal character of the reading experience that implies the temporal character of the writing experience, that implies the temporal character of the experience of the characters in the novel. So that's the novel. Thematizes time. Time is a character. In lyric poetry, by contrast, and this is what makes it different from epic poetry is narrative. In other words, there's very little difference between epic poetry and epic fiction, except for the fact that epic poetry is the oral tradition, and so you memorize the story of the tribe through rhyme and meter. That's how people could memorize it before writing and after writing. Lyric poetry is not narrative. So what does that mean? It means that it tries to raise the moment out of the flow of time. It raises the moment out of any kind of narrative sequence. Right? It's about elevating the moment through imagery. Right, so it's a different relationship to time. And therefore a different relationship to language and what language can do, right? We did talk about, with Kafka, the Halakha and the Haggadah, we talked about the two dimensions of the scripture of the Old Testament. The law-giving versus the storytelling, right? So you could read the Bible as giving you instructions, laying down the law, or you can read it as telling a story. And then the whole struggle of exegesis is figuring out, is this telling a story or is it laying down the law? Now when it becomes parabolic, when it becomes a parable, then it's like a weird mixture, because it's telling a story, it's allegorical, that is also instructing, it's sort of teaching through storytelling, and so seems to be also laying down the law. So the parable is this weird combination of storytelling and law-giving, and that's why it's so significant in Kafka, because Kafka's parables, right? are, what is he doing? Is he teaching us? Is he telling us a story? Is he laying down some existential truths, laws? What's going on here? Okay, so with poetry, with lyric poetry, we don't expect it to be laying down a law or telling a story. So then what is it doing? It is instantiating subjectivity in a different way. Again, in some ways, the lyric poem is even more about the subjectivity of the individual than the novel is. And it's about the subjectivity of the individual in several dimensions. One is the subjectivity of the writer, so the lyric voice of the poet. The other is the the individual subjectivity of the reader. When you read a lyric poem, you feel like you're having more of an intimate, personal, individual experience than when you read a novel. Remember, in What is Epic Theater, he begins with the example of reading a novel. He says, Brecht's trying to do plays to give the viewer of the play the same experience as reading a novel. In a kind of leisurely, relaxed, kind of critical and circumspect activity. Poetry, no, lyric poetry, it's different. You're meant to be caught up in the moment. Right? The poet is caught up in the moment. The poem is sort of crystallizing a moment through language, and the individual reader is supposed to have that same kind of experience. Okay, so that's why it's so intense to say, in the lyric poem, here it is the commodity itself that speaks. I will also say about language, since we read The Task of the Translator, and it's about translating poetry, lyric poetry. It's about translating Baudelaire. In poetry, more than in narrative literature, more than in scripture, in poetry, the meaning of the words, the meaning of the syntax, the meaning of the grammar, the meaning of language is stretched to the limit. It's really about getting language to say something that it doesn't ordinarily say, that it's not ordinarily capable of saying. So it's not discursive. It's like the opposite of discursive. And it's the opposite of that kind of discursive, grammatical, linguistic communication. Right, so we talked about, we looked at on the mimetic faculty, the non-sensuous similarity. Okay, so we've dealt with constellation, and also we looked at the experience in poverty, construction, and I said these are two related concepts, construction and constellation. So again, crystallization, so constellation. So a lyric poem is like a constellation of images that crystallize a moment. But it does so through words. Nonetheless, it does so through words. So it transcends the normal flow, the discursive character of language. It takes language outside of time, seems to monumentalize language in a particular way. But again, not in the sort of tribal oral history kind of storytelling kind of way that language can become monumentalized, nor in the law-giving way that language can be monumentalized. No, it's monumentalized more at the level of an aesthetic object. It turns words themselves into like objects. It turns images into objects. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to tie as much in as possible. The quotable gesture, the justice, when action becomes an image. Oh, that happens in poetry. When you take images out of the flow of time and crystallize them and arrange them as a constellation. And of course you do so in a constructed way. Now, in a very clearly constructed way, usually traditionally with rhyme and meter, where there's conventional kind of forms that are recognizable to the reader. We're out of the habit of reading poetry, of course. And also we have modernist free verse happening in the meantime. But Baudelaire's not free verse, he's not. He's rhyme and meter. He's traditional lyric poetry, rhyme and meter, definitely. Now, one of the things that we didn't talk about was what makes Baudelaire so remarkable as a poet in his own time, was recognized readily by readers, and why his poetry is suppressed, why there are obscenity trials around his poetry, where they suppress publication of his book. There are a few instances, right? So it's ostensibly on subject matter. However, it's more than that. It has to do with the fact that he combines very traditional, elevated, aristocratic language of lyric poetry, like language that you would recognize as like, okay, that's poetic language, with vulgarities. And we completely lose that in the English translation in a kind of funny way. I mean, they try. I think that did we read to the, last time we read to the reader? Yeah. So, sometimes it comes across well, sometimes it doesn't. Translators are all over the place, meaning like they're good, they're bad, they're whatever. But the good translation gets you that tension between the elevated language of the lyric and the harsh vulgarisms that are that just have a visceral impact. And that's what he did musically in French. What he did was he seamlessly combined vulgarisms with elevated poetic language, so that musically it's all brought to the same level. So he's kind of elevating vulgarisms and seemingly debasing the poetic at the same time. Right, but it's precisely that makes it the poetry of capitalism. Because capitalism is about the profane, the vulgar, the material, the secular. All these genres are ancient genres. Lyric poetry is an ancient genre. Narrative literature, epic literature, ancient genre. Even the novel has ancient roots. There are ancient predecessors for the modern novel, for the bourgeois novel. So they're all ancient genres, and yet what Baudelaire was trying to do is rescue lyric poetry in a time that is seemingly hostile to lyric poetry, the capitalist era, and yet also creates an opportunity for lyric poetry in a new and different way, such that maybe only in capitalism can we have lyric poetry. In fact, lyric poetry that clearly is about the song of the individual, the moment of individual subjectivity, that is not still in this kind of weird aristocratic realm before capitalism. So again, another precedent of this would be Shakespeare. Shakespeare's lyrics. So he's got his plays, but he's also got his lyric poetry, and they're both hugely influential for what comes later, including impacting just narrative literature, not impacting neither drama, stage drama, nor simply lyric poetry. Right. Elizabethan England, bourgeois society. This is when bourgeois society is happening. This is when it's happening. So it starts with Henry VIII, but by Elizabeth I, it's totally happening. Totally happening. Completely coming together. That's why Shakespeare is Shakespeare. And it's popular. It's popular. It's popular. It's for the vulgar masses. Okay, so doing that in the 19th century, however, is challenging. There are some issues with regard to this because literature is being kitschified, it's being popularized, it's being banalized. So to rescue it from that, in the same way that drama had become sort of banalized, become become banal. Baudelaire has to do some things. He has to try some new things in order to rescue the power of lyric poetry. So this is modernism. So you can't go on like before. Bourgeois, all the bourgeois genres that had emerged since the Renaissance had fully come into their own, achieved what they could achieve in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 19th century, the idea here is that all of these forms that had developed between the Renaissance and the 18th century were in crisis in the 19th century. Painting, lyric poetry, narrative literature, sculpture, of course, architecture, we'll see. And this is because society itself is in crisis in capitalism. And yet there is a modernist response in all these domains. An attempt to be true to the time, which means embodying these bourgeois social forms in crisis. And I think that we looked at the Baudelaire where he says we need a modern beauty. So it's different from the ancient beauty. We need modern beauty because we have a different life, therefore we have a different sensibility, a different psychology. I think we looked at the Manet. We looked at the Olympia. Yeah. So we looked at the difference in eros between Renaissance bourgeois versus 19th century capitalists. Our basic psychology, our erotic feeling, everything has changed. Okay, so just because I put this on the screen, I don't want to have it staring down at us. The commodity, right? So this is Strange Labor or Alienated Labor. It's from the 1844 manuscripts by Marx. This is also immanent critique. He says we've proceeded from the premises of political economy, meaning Marx is operating immanently within the bourgeois terminology and categories and concepts. But he says, on the basis of political economy itself, in its own words, we have shown that the worker sinks to the level of a commodity and indeed becomes the most wretched of commodities. Okay, so Baudelaire. Okay, so he is a bourgeois, not a proletariat, not a proletarian subject, but a bourgeois subject. Nonetheless, he is giving proletarian subjectivity, of course. Nonetheless, he is. Commodity form. So now we have commodities. So let's talk about commodity for a second. Okay, so for something to be a commodity, commodity means a form, so the commodity form of what? Form of value. Well, we'll see value of what? Well, let's just stick with form of value. All right. So for something to be a commodity, it has to be two values simultaneously. It has to be a use value, and it has to be an exchange value. So it has to be both of those things. It has to be use value and exchange value. Simultaneously. For something to be a commodity, it has to be useful to someone in some way, and it has to be exchangeable. So if something's useless, it can't be a commodity. If something's not exchangeable, it can't be a commodity. So use value and exchange value. However, as a use value, it is incommensurable with any other use value. Meaning every use value is qualitative in character. It's concrete, meaning the use of something is always concrete in space and time, and therefore particular. And that's what makes it incommensurable. So any use of something by someone at any given place in space and time is incommensurable with any other use value. It's particular.
And the
Hello?
first word, concrete, particular, and
Qualitative.
qualitative.
Qualitative. Qualitative. Qualitative. To be an exchange value, therefore, is the opposite. For something to be exchangeable, it has to be commensurable. It has to be commensurable. And that means it has to be subject to something like quantification. Quantitative. Particular. In order to quantify the value of something, in order to make it commensurable, you have to abstract it. From its utility in space and time. And you have to be able to make its value general. Or even, we could say, universal. So the commodity form is very powerful. It's a form of social relation. We'll see. We'll talk about that in a second. It's very powerful because it combines these things. It combines the qualitative and the quantitative. It combines the concrete and the abstract. It combines the particular and the general or universal. Now, there were always commodities. As long as human communities have existed, there have been things that have been traded. There have been useful things that have been traded by people. So there have been commodities. However, there was one thing that was not a commodity until the bourgeois era, until the Renaissance era. That was labor itself.
What?
Labor itself.
Oh, labor.
Labor itself was not a commodity until the bourgeois era. And that's because the bourgeois era is about the emancipation of labor. It's about the serfs leaving the land. It's about abolishing slavery. It's about freeing labor from the guilds, freeing production from the guilds. Okay, so when labor becomes a commodity, it's because labor is a social relation. And a social relation is a relation, I think that we've talked about this. It's a relation to or a relation with others, of course. So it's a relation between people. But it's also a relation to nature. And it's a relation to ourselves. It's a self-relation. So in pre-bourgeois society, what was the dominant form of social relation throughout all civilizations? Religion. Meaning we related to others, to nature, and to ourselves through religious morality. Again, the will of the gods, or the will of God, or the will of the divine forces that we respect, venerate, worship, treat sacred through religion. So it's about the sacrality of other human beings or other members of society, the sacrality of nature, and the sacrality of oneself. So one treats oneself as sacred. Yes? Okay. Now we have social relations of labor. meaning what are others? They're collaborators. What is nature? Something to transform through our labor. What are we to ourselves? Workers. Make yourself useful. Be a productive member of society. Be a contributing participant in society.
Can you repeat what social relation of labor with respect to others?
Collaborators. Collaborators. Because bourgeois society understands itself as cooperation. In other words, we're not united as a society by God, but by our cooperative labor. Meaning it's the end of tribalism. God made the Jews a community.
And what about the nature?
Nature, something that we transform through our labor. So, indeed, this is our religion. This is our religion. So I was going to say, we relate to ourselves as workers, which is why when we are unemployed due to either being laid off or by winning the lottery, the same thing happens. We become drug addicts and die. All right, we experience an existential crisis, cosmic crisis. All right, so commodity fetishism. Fetish is not the psychological Freudian idea of fetish. It's not a substitute object. It's not a replacement satisfaction. It's not a displaced desire. Fetish in the anthropological sense of it's our religion. It's our metaphysics. So Marx was quoting the 1844 manuscripts. There he has a treatment of Hegel, and also elsewhere he says that Hegel's metaphysics is a metaphysics of labor. It's the bourgeois metaphysics. The whole point of capitalism is that the Industrial Revolution has thrown the social relations of labor into crisis, because it means that our social relation and our social mediation is no longer that of labor as a commodity, but rather through the general social intellect of science and technology. So that our social metaphysics, our social relations of labor are thrown into crisis by the Industrial Revolution, because we're no longer mediating society at the level of the exchange of labor as a commodity, but we are doing so through the general social intellect of science and technology. Although we try to keep the bourgeois social relations going. So we still sign labor contracts, we still exchange our labor power with employers, we still exchange our labor time for money with which to buy other commodities that sustain our ability to work. Right, so we still live in a commodity economy and in a society of the social relations of labor. So we live in the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. That's how Marx defined capitalism. Capitalism is defined by the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. But the bourgeois social relations are not about the property of rich people. It's about labor as a commodity. Bourgeois social relations that are contradicted by the industrial forces of production are the social relations of labor as a commodity. So it's about the working class. It's not about rich people, not working class people. Which is why they are the ones who have to change it. Because otherwise, I always like to say, I could give a TED talk at Davos, and And I could convince all the billionaires that we should have communism instead of capitalism, and they'd be like, you know what, Cutrone, you're right about that. But they would not be able to do it. They would not be able to bring it about. They would not be able to do it. Because they would get resistance from working class. Yeah. Okay. Marxism. Because workers would insist on the value of their labor as a commodity. Because what else do we have? This is our social relations. That's it. What is it that Donald Trump says? He's for the right to life and the dignity of work. The dignity of work. And the recognition that if people don't have work, they lose their dignity. That's what's going on. And they try to find it some other way. National identity, racism, other kinds of identity politics. No. The only way we can really have our dignity in this society is through the actual social relations of this society. Being a useful person, productive member of society, contributor in your participation. Okay. So if you ever wonder why your life sucks, it has something to do with this.
You have to get a job.
Yes. You have to be useful to someone in some way. You do. Everything's commodified. Everything is commodified. Everything. Sex, feelings, psychology, everything. It's the total reality. Total reality. Everything. Everything. It's a cosmology. All right, so that's the importance of speaking with the voice of the commodity. All right, let's. I think that's what we left out from last week. So let's see what Benjamin has to say about Baudelaire. Second pass on Baudelaire, right? So his first pass on Baudelaire was the Paris and the Second Empire in Baudelaire. Second pass on Baudelaire on some motifs. So he went back to the drawing board, wrote another essay on Baudelaire. Baudelaire envisaged readers to whom the reading of lyric poetry would present difficulties. The introductory poem of the Fleur de Mal is addressed to these readers, so we read that last time. Boredom. Boredom. Willpower and the ability to concentrate are not among their strong points. So the modern reader doesn't have willpower or concentrated attention as a strong point. Unlike the bourgeois subject has willpower, has the ability to concentrate, for sure. No person. Huh?
Until recently.
Yeah, well, until 200 years ago, which is relatively recent in the history of the cosmos. It's relatively recent, but it's also nothing new. All right, so what they prefer is sensual pleasures. They are familiar with the spleen, so it's the melancholy, which kills interest and receptiveness. Oh, sound like our world? Guess what? 200 years. We've been here for 200 years. It is strange to come across a lyric poet who addresses himself to this, the least rewarding type of audience. There is, of course, a ready explanation for it. Baudelaire was anxious to be understood. He dedicates his book to kindred spirits. The poem addressed to the reader ends with the salutation, hypocrite reader, my doppelganger, my brother. It might be more fruitful to put it in another way and say Baudelaire wrote a book which from the very beginning had little prospect of becoming an immediate popular success. Meaning, it's not going to be a valued commodity off the bat. The kind of reader he envisaged is described in the introductory poem, and this turned out to have been a far-sighted judgment. The situation, the fact, in other words, that the climate for lyric poetry has become increasingly inhospitable, is attested to, among other things, by three factors. In the first place, the lyric poet has ceased to represent the poet per se. He no longer is a minstrel, as Lamartine still was. He has become a representative of a genre. Verlaine is a concrete example of this specialization. Rimbaud must already be regarded as an esoteric figure, a poet who maintained an ex officio distance between his public and his work. So this is all going to come back when we do surrealism, because Baudelaire, Verlaine, Rimbaud, also Mallarmé, they're the sort of forerunners of surrealism. Secondly, there has been no success on a mass scale in lyric poetry since Baudelaire. The lyric poetry of Victor Hugo was still able to set off powerful reverberations when it first appeared. In Germany, Heine's Book of Songs, I guess, marks a watershed. So Heine is one generation before Baudelaire. Heine is a kind of a pre-Baudelairean character. Heine, I will also say, is personally acquainted with both Hegel and Marx. So he knew Hegel, he moved to Paris, and when Marx moved to Paris, he hooked up with Heine. As a result, a third factor was the great coolness of the public, even toward the lyric poetry that had been handed down as part of its own cultural heritage. The period in question dates back roughly to the middle of the last century, so 1848, 1840s. Throughout it, the fame of the Fleur du Mal has constantly spread. So basically, he's attained late popularity. This book, which was expected to be read by the least indulgent of readers, and which was at first read by a few indulgent ones, has over the decades acquired the stature of a classic and become one of the most widely printed ones as well. So remember what he said about Proust, about the every great work founds and dissolves a genre. So Baudelaire dissolved and founded lyric poetry in the capitalist era. If conditions for a positive reception of lyric poetry have become less favorable, it is reasonable to assume that only in rare instances is lyric poetry in rapport with the experience of its readers. This may be due to a change in the structure of their experience. Even though one may approve of this development, one may be all the more hard put to it to say precisely in what respect there may have been a change. Thus one turns to philosophy for an answer, which brings one up against a strange situation. Since the end of the last century, philosophy has made a series of attempts to lay hold of the true experience, as opposed to the kind that manifests itself in the standardized, denatured life of the civilized masses. So remember that we read the Program of Becoming Philosophy and Bergson. We'll see. Bergson comes after Baudelaire. So Bergson, who influenced Proust, comes later, but Baudelaire is anticipating this in Benjamin's view. It is customary to classify these efforts under the heading of a philosophy of life, or Lebensphilosophy. That's the term in German, Lebensphilosophy. Their point of departure, understandably enough, was not man's life in society. What they invoked was poetry, preferably nature, and most recently, the age of myths. Dilthey's book, Experience and Writing, represents one of the earliest of these efforts, which end with Klages and Young, both made common cause with fascism. So, in other words, rejecting the experience in society in favor of this other kind of experience, and that leads to fascism. Now remember what Baudelaire is to Marxists. When Benjamin is writing this, what is Baudelaire to Marxists? He's bourgeois decadent. And what's going on in the 1930s? Bourgeois decadence has a political movement. It's called fascism. And ironically enough, the fascists are anti-decadent, and yet from the Marxist perspective, they're pure decadence. Guess what? From the fascist perspective, Marxism is pure decadence. They're both right about that, of course. Right? Because it's about capitalism is decadent. It's not about these people being decadent versus those people being decadent. It's capitalism itself that's decadent. Towering above this literature is Bergson's early monumental work, Matter and Memory. More than the others, it preserves links with empirical research. It is oriented towards biology. So Bergson is trying to keep a marriage between science and philosophy in a way that the reactionary philosophers are not. The reactionary philosophers are opposing philosophy against science. Heidegger. Philosophy and science are opposites, which is a bit bizarre if you think about it. Why should they be opposites? Opposites. The title suggests that it regards the structure of memory as decisive for the philosophical pattern of experience. Experience is indeed a matter of tradition in collective existence as well as private life. It is less the product of facts firmly anchored in memory than of a convergence in memory of accumulated and frequently unconscious data. It is, however, not at all Bergson's intention to attach any specific historical label to memory. On the contrary, he rejects any historical determination of memory. He thus manages above all to stay clear of that experience from which his own philosophy evolved, or rather in reaction to which it arose. It was the inhospitable, blinding age of big-scale industrialism. In shutting out this experience, the eye perceives an experience of a complementary nature in the form of its spontaneous afterimage, as it were. Bergson's philosophy represents an attempt to give the details of this afterimage and to fix it as a permanent record. His philosophy thus indirectly furnishes a clue to the experience which presented itself to Baudelaire's eyes in its undistorted version in the figure of the reader. Okay, let's unpack that. So, Bergson is a philosopher of the Second Industrial Revolution. So, really high-tech Industrial Revolution in comparison to the First Industrial Revolution. The First Industrial Revolution is steam power. The Second Industrial Revolution is electromagnetic revolution. It's not the thermodynamic revolution, it's the electromagnetic revolution. And that's why it brings with it quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity. And we're still there, right? We still are in the electromagnetic revolution. We've intensified it, but we haven't departed from it by any means. So that's why I, for one, would reject that there's no third or fourth industrial revolution. We're still in the second industrial revolution. We're still in the electromagnetic. That's why physics has not proceeded beyond quantum mechanics and relativity. Because why would it? Okay. So, but he's saying Bergson, his account of experience is the flip side or kind of negative impression, afterimage of the industrial age in which it's written. So Bergson is still trying to keep science and philosophy together, but there is nonetheless this opposition. But it's not yet a reified opposition. The way it becomes later with Heidegger, just to say. Because of course Heidegger, he doesn't talk about Heidegger. However, we should keep it in mind. Since Benjamin is usually assimilated to Heidegger. No, it should not be. Because after all, the Marxism, philosophy and science, there should be some relation. Historical relation. What's the relation between philosophy and science? History. They coexist historically. okay, so time, history, memory. Matter and memory defines the nature of experience in that durée in such a way that the reader is bound to conclude that only a poet can be the adequate subject of such an experience. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. When we read Bergson, I mentioned to you the famous debate that Bergson had with Einstein, where Einstein said, what you philosophers call time, we physicists know doesn't actually exist. Boom. Okay, so where does time exist? The idea is that it doesn't objectively exist. No, it exists subjectively. Meaning, any subjectivity must have a conception of time and space. This is basic Kant. Even though we know from history that our conceptions of time and space have changed. Across cultures, across history, our experience of time and space has changed. Why? Because the subject has changed. The subject has changed. So what does it mean to write a philosophy that only a poet can understand? Is philosophy about the subjective or the objective? Especially because Bergson wanted to keep science and philosophy connected. Shouldn't philosophy be about the relation between the subjective and the objective? Sorry, I'll make another reference to Nietzsche. So Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy, he said, art ended when Socrates arrived on the scene and Plato and Aristotle followed from him and distinguished between subjective and objective truth. So art is about subjective truth. In Nietzsche's view, theoretical man, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, it's about objective truth. Then later, a further distinction between philosophy and science, maybe science is about objective truth, in which case philosophy is about the connection between subjective and objective truth. So philosophy would stand somewhere between art and science, which is why it tends to collapse in either direction. Philosophy tends to collapse, become art, or collapse, become science. But philosophy itself comes from religion, comes from theology. As does art and science, but we've talked about this, how art and science also come from religion, kind of, but they come more from magic than from religion. Art has roots in magic. Science as science comes from magic. Just to use a basic anthropological distinction between religion and magic. Philosophy, it's more of a straight descent from religion, straight descent from theology. Meaning philosophy is about meaning and value, essence. It's about the sacred in a way that art and science doesn't have to be. They don't have to be. They don't. They're free of that. So again, there's a particular paradox at work here in saying that in order to really grasp what a philosopher, Bergson, was talking about, you have to be a poet. Or it has to be in the form of poetry. Only a poet can be the adequate subject of such an experience. And he says, and indeed it was a poet who put Bergson's theory of experience to the test, and that's Proust. So Proust's work, In Search of Lost Time, may be regarded as an attempt to produce experience synthetically, meaning there's an experience that you can only have reading Proust. There's an experience you can only have reading poetry. And it looks like philosophy is trying to do that. Philosophy is trying to describe experience, but then it's also trying to produce an experience. And yet when it just produces an experience, then it becomes poetry. produce an experience synthetically, as Bergson imagines it, under today's conditions. For there is less and less hope that it will come into being naturally. Meaning, we don't spontaneously naturally have this kind of experience. We can only have it objectified in the form of poetry. Proust, incidentally, does not evade the question in his work. He even introduces a new factor, one that involves an imminent critique of Bergson. Bergson emphasized the antagonism between the vita activa and the specific vita contemplativa, which arises from memory. Meaning there's the life lived and there's the life contemplated. But there's the life contemplated through memory. But he leads us to believe that turning to the contemplative actualization of the stream of life is a matter of free choice. So the voluntary versus involuntary memory. From the start, Proust indicates his divergent view terminologically. Okay, so synthetically, voluntarily, or a matter of will and concentration, contemplation, that precisely Baudelaire is saying the reader will not have. Not have that ability. Okay, so our subjectivity seems to escape us in terms of our actual lived experience, vita activa. And instead is only capturable or even experienceable. Our subjectivity is only experienceable in objectified form. And so, why this is important? Relationship between art and life. Relationship between art and life. So Baudelaire, modernism, this is the beginning of the idea that you live your life not through your actual life, but through the artwork you create. That your art is your actual life rather than your life. So Proust, right? So Proust is this melancholy guy. Life seems to have passed him by, but no, it didn't pass him by because he can live it again through his writing his novel, and then in the novel you can experience what defied the ability to experience in actual life. You live your life in memory. You live your life in objectified form. It's not just any memory. Voluntary, synthetic memory. Constructed memory. Objectified memory. Alienated memory. Alienated memory. So the fact that art might express alienated life. Art and life. Does art imitate life? Does life imitate art? Well, maybe art and life diverge. And art becomes a strange refuge for what seems to be denied us in life. We did last time the theological political fragment, no, 2 times ago, right? Was it 2 times ago we did theological political fragment? And remember there, right, everything that is denied in life, don't worry, it will come in paradise. You will have the physical happiness in your body that you didn't have in this life. And all that has to happen is the world has to come to an end. That's all that has to happen. Time has to stop. I'm watching a TV series from a few years ago. I didn't watch it at the time. So it's Invasion. It's like an Apple TV Plus science fiction. And it's just gotten to the real meat of it. So it's got like 2 seasons of setup, and then the 3rd season is when it really comes together. And so it turns out that this like aliens have invaded, and so humans are fighting back against the aliens. But then there's a religious cult that thinks that the alien invasion is like the path to salvation. Right? That basically that the aliens are killing off humanity in order to give humanity immortality.
There's a cult that actually did that.
90s. I think it was Heaven's Gate. They all killed themselves because a comet was coming and they thought it was a spaceship.
Right. So this is what we do. Right, so the aliens will save us, the aliens will doom us, the aliens will doom and save us at the same time, something along those lines, right? So basically, and then the cult fights against the government that's trying to fight against the aliens, because they see the government as trying to prevent the apocalypse that they're embracing. It's kind of cool. Anyway, yes? So redemption. Because when it's revealed that the cult is fighting the government, it's when the cult leader slits the throat of the government agent, and she says, I'm not your enemy, I'm your redeemer. Okay, so anyway, sorry for the digression. Art and life. Does art redeem life? Has art taken the place of religion? Cult of art. Is Baudelaire part of the cult of art? Because very clearly, Benjamin says, Baudelaire is not l'art polar. He's not l'art polar. He's not. He actually wants to find the utility for art, an actual utility for art. He wants his art to be a commodity. So he does not define his art as not a commodity, which is the way generally the Romantic strain, ever since capitalism, has been doing that. That art is authentic when it resists commodification. No, Benjamin is saying art is authentic when it embraces commodification, to the point of even the commodification of the soul itself. But in capitalism, that's desperate. That's a desperate thing, because capitalism is destroying the commodity. And so even that's not a solution. The full embrace of the commodity is no solution, because capitalism has already destroyed it. Right, so there seem to be two kind of alternatives: art as resistance to commodity and art as fully commodity. But neither actually works. And also modernism is some strange connection between those two, meaning it does come out of Romanticism, and yet flips a value and says, okay, what seems like a loss in the capitalist era is actually a gain. So it's an attempt to assimilate art to capitalism that actually shows that that can't really happen, because capitalism is not a thing. Capitalism is a contradiction. So in trying to assimilate art to capitalism, art assimilates itself to the contradiction. So in the resistance, that would be the Romantic, the idea of like, art is good because there's no market for it, or art is good because it's useless. Art is good because it has no buyer or no reader, right? That shows that it's really true, right? Not a commodity. Not exchangeable, not useful. So Gautier, who is the coiner of the phrase l'art polar, he defined the value of art as being what is useless.
What is the other one?
That would be just pure embrace of, commodity. So just like writing just for the market. Which is also paradoxical. So it's kind of, you can't really do either of those things unproblematically, although you can try. You can try to go in one or the other direction.
How do you spell the name of the guy who said that?
Gautier, Gautier. Gautier. Théophile Gautier. The reigning form of political economy and also moral philosophy in the early 19th century is utilitarianism. So Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, utilitarianism. And Jeremy Bentham coined the happiness principle, the greatest good for the greatest number. So society should pursue the happiness principle. It should seek to provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That is actually what we try to do. Achieve the greatest good for the greatest number of people. You know that you can't achieve the full good for everyone, but you try to get the greatest good for the greatest number. And Gautier was like, well, art can't follow that principle. Art can't follow that principle. It has to follow a completely different principle that can't be quantified, that can't be moralized, and that can't be rendered a political kind of ethic. Right, so, but the point being that Baudelaire is not that. So Baudelaire could be assimilated to aestheticism or the cult of art, l'art pour l'art. But in fact, Baudelaire sort of defies that definition. And in that way,
Definition of happiness principle.
yeah. Well, or of the resistance to the happiness principle. So, if you recall from last week, in the previous essay, we had the dialectical opposites were Hugo and Baudelaire. So Hugo would be the kitsch, and Baudelaire would be the avant-garde. And so the same things are going on in both, but more clearly in Baudelaire. That's the idea. And also, Hugo's a little bit rearguard or backward in comparison to Baudelaire. Baudelaire's more avant-garde, meaning he's more ahead of the curve. All right. Let's- Do we not have one for this week? Hold on, did I not post something for this week? Oh, I did not. I'm sorry. Somehow I did not post our second week of Baudelaire.
This one.
Hmm? Yeah, I thought I did, but I guess I didn't. Yeah, all right.
Oh, Yoko did.
Here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. So you guys are the presenters now. Who's the presenters for this week?
I did, last class we didn't get.
We didn't get
to
to the notes, that's
Yeah,
what-
so those are the notes. Last class it was Rose and I
Uh-huh.
for the Paris of the Second Empire, and this class is Yoko and I for Ensemble.
Uh-huh, okay. All right, so let's, Tommy posted some notes as well. Okay, so we've got two sets of notes for review problem. We got last week and this week? Okay. All right, so let's look at the two poems, which we will come back to again. Also, just keep in mind when we do surrealism. But let me find this. The Ragpicker's Wine and To Passerby. Okay, so I think we talked about this a little bit last time, and it's going to be also foregrounded here, and especially next week. So the prostitute, we didn't talk about the prostitute. We talked about the prostitute in terms of like the turning sex into a pure like labor process, commodity activity, and but we didn't talk about the prostitute as model for the artist. So the artist is a prostitute. That's the other reason why the prostitute is an exemplar for Baudelaire, is that he's a prostitute. As a writer, he's a prostitute. So,
How? In the way that the artist will still their body through.
They're feeling. They're feeling. It's not enough. The body's not enough. It's affective labor. It's emotional labor.
Yeah,
I've never
I
heard this
was
language.
sorry, I didn't mean exactly just the material body, but like the embodied practice, right?
The experience, yes.
Okay.
So the poet is providing an experience as a commodity in the same way that the prostitute is providing an experience.
The commodity.
Yeah. Okay. So there are various ways of thinking about the poet. And here's another one, the ragpicker. So what is a ragpicker? So it's the secondary economy. So literally it's poor people who go and get stuff out of the trash of rich people and then resell it. And this is actually a huge part of the global economy right now, in case you guys didn't know this. All right, so ragpickers. And so that's been going on since the Industrial Revolution. So is the poet a ragpicker? In other words, is the poet selling secondhand experience? Secondhand experience. Often in some red street lamp's glare, whose flame the wind flaps, rattling at its glassy frame, in the mired labyrinth of some old slum, where crawling multitudes ferment their scum, with judge-like nods a ragpicker comes reeling, bumping on walls like poets without feeling, and scorning cops, now vassals of his state, begins on glorious subjects to dilate. Takes royal oaths, dictates his laws sublime, exalts the injured and chastises crime, and spreading his own dais on the sky, is dazzled by his virtues, starred on high. Yes, these folk, badgered by domestic care, ground down by toil, decrepitude, despair, buckled beneath the foul load that each carries, the motley vomit of enormous Paris, come home, vat-scented, trailing clouds of glory, followed by veteran comrades battle-hoary, whose whiskers stream like banners as each marches, flags, torches, flowers, and steep triumphal arches. Rise up for them in magic hues and burn, since through this dazzling orgy they return, while drums and clarions daze the sun above, with glory to a nation drunk with love. Thus one, through giddy human life is rolled, like Pactolus, a stream of burning gold. So that's vomiting. You get drunk, you vomit. Through man's own throat his exploits it will sing, and reign by gifts as best befits a king. So a poet is like vomiting. Like the lyric song is like the vomiting. To lull their laziness and drown their rancor, for storm-tossed wrecks a temporary anchor, God in remorse made sleep. Man added wine, child of the sun, immortal and divine. All right, so part of the pleasure of getting drunk, the intoxication, is vomiting? No, it's like the opposite, right? And yet, that's also the essence of it. And so, is the poet vomiting up and offering a kind of secondhand intoxication? And notice that the rags are the motley vomit of enormous Paris, meaning that the secondhand goods that are being sold by the poor rag pickers are like the vomited, like pre-digested. Do you know the birds that vomit into their chicks' mouths? Yes, it's pre-digested. Is that what the poet is doing? Giving you a pre-digested experience. And vomiting up pre-digested experience as like a secondhand intoxication, or a secondary effect of the poet's own intoxication. And that this is connected directly to the secondary commodity economy, where the commodity has a second life, being fished out of the trash and sold again. So it's a secondhand experience, secondhand commodity, vomited up experience. And a flip side to the original intoxication, but that can only be realized through the vomiting, through the regurgitation. Right, so the experience that can only be had in poetry, but then what is poetry? Is in poetry a kind of regurgitated experience, not the actual experience? And yet that is the actual experience? Right. So what we were just talking about, like this paradox, that poetry objectifies experience, but it's an experience that can only be had in reading the poem. Now, the romantic version of poetry that resists commodification would have us believe that the poem is like a kind of imitation of the experience, that it's sort of suggesting an experience that can't quite be articulated. But that's not the point. The point is it's an experience that can only be had through the articulation. So it's not an experience that you try to capture imperfectly through language. It's the experience that can only be had in the language. So again, the task of the translator. So translatability. So maybe we only have our experience, in fact, when we objectify it, not just living it. That's why Benjamin's taking issue with the philosophy of life, or the Liebman's philosophy, right? The philosophy that says, like, you know, the truth is not in philosophy, it's in life. And it's like, well, but wait, what if what if it is in fact the case that it's not in life but in the philosophy? What if it's not in life but in art? And again, that's where does art redeem life? And do we sacrifice our lives in order to make works of art, which is a funny way of redeeming our lives, actually. Because after all, the life can only be had through the art and not just through living. We read the Karl Kraus, right? So Karl Kraus, what did Karl Kraus say about sex and masturbation? He said, sometimes sex with a woman is a passable substitute for masturbation, but it takes a lot of imagination and work. Right? So actual sex is actually it's a simulation of masturbation. So what would be the significance of flipping that around is to say maybe the only actual erotic satisfaction you get is with a prostitute, not with an actual lover. So the courtesan in Titian's Venus of Urbino. Okay, so marriage was political, it was economic, it was social, it was about producing offspring and connecting families. It wasn't about love or erotic life. Court poetry, right? So we're going to talk about this later when we get to surrealism. We have some anticipation of it now. The idea that there are, like, do you guys know, like, why am I forgetting the actual phrase for it? You know the poetry I'm talking about, from the medieval court. So there are so let's say you're a noble person, whether man or woman, but you're a noble aristocrat. So there are three kinds of love objects. There's the sort of filial love object, so that's the person your family and the person you're married to. Then there's the person you have sex with. And then there's the person that you are in love with, but you never have sex with them, and you write poetry about. That's real, right? And that's some kind of a precedent. We will see. Not for this, but for this. All right, to a passerby. So again, this is the erotic experience that's only possible in the modern city of capitalism, the anonymous mass society of capitalism. Amid the deafening traffic of the town, tall, slender, in deep mourning, with majesty, a woman passed, raising with dignity in her poised hand the flounces of her gown. Graceful, noble, with a statue's form. And I drank, trembling as a madman thrills from her eyes, ashen sky where brooded storm, the softness that fascinates, the pleasure that kills. A flash, then night. O lovely fugitive, I am suddenly reborn from your swift glance. Shall I never see you till eternity? Somewhere far off, too late, never, perchance. Neither knows where the other goes or lives. We might have loved, and you knew this might be. Right, so he's passing a woman on the street, and she's like, "Who is this psycho?" And he's like, "Flash the night, softness that humans." Right, so there's a lot of projection, maybe it's a lot of projection involved. So the psychology, if we bring Freud back in, there's a lot of psychology of identification and projection. The other is just a mirror for the self. And it just, a stranger on the street is a mirror for the self. And she's in mourning. So instead of attracted to that, she seems kind of withdrawn and sad and kind of melancholic, and that's what attracts him to her. Because he sees himself in her. Right? But she doesn't really notice him at all, and that makes her even more significant. Right, so it's two people passing on the city street, each narcissistically enclosed in their own self. And they don't meet. They don't even really acknowledge each other, and that is like the height of erotic charge. It's modernity. It's life in capitalism. All right, let's take a short break and we'll come back to your notes then. And get into what you guys wanted to discuss in this essay, and we'll catch up on things that we didn't get to talk about last week. All right, let's resume. So I wanted to start the second half of class with a poem by Baudelaire. I think that we will encounter again. We're anticipating the Surrealism Week coming up, but let's nonetheless address it. So we've had constellations, constructions, correspondences. That's another term that Benjamin uses, and here its origin for that is in Baudelaire. Nature is a temple where the living columns sometimes breathe confusing speech. Man walks within these groves of symbols, each of which regards him as a kindred thing. As the long echoes, shadowy, profound, heard from afar, blend in a unity, vast as the night, as sunlight's clarity, so perfumes, colors, sounds may correspond. Odors there are, fresh as a baby's skin, mellow as oboes, green as meadow grass. Others corrupted, rich, triumphant, full, having dimensions infinitely vast, frankincense, musk, ambergris, Benjamin, singing the senses' rupture in the souls. Take that thing theory. Take that object-oriented ontology. It's all there already, all there. And so, I think we talk about the idea that art adds to things. Yes, we talked about this with translation, right? So translation adds. So it doesn't, it's not lesser than the original, it's more than the original because it's adding. So art adds to the world. It isn't like a kind of dispensable redundancy. It's not like a kind of imitation of the world that could be dispensed with. No. Similarly, language adds to things. Right? So it's not like language is like a poor representation of something. It's an expression that exceeds its source. And so there's more. It's not less, it's more. Right? Otherwise, what would be the point of literature? If you're not adding to life, then what would be the point of it? Right? So that's why Benjamin rejects like semiotics, and he rejects communication and reception theory. He rejects all that because that would make all these things redundant, inessential. No, they're essential. They're essential. They add to nature. We transform nature through art. We don't just do a pale, redundant imitation of it. Art is more than life, not less than life, because it adds to life.
Is the idea of correspondences from a ritual context or like an occult context, or is it from more just like a literary?
I think here it's from a literary context, but it seems to invoke, right? Doesn't it seem to invoke a lot more than that?
Right, because it starts with like the idea of a temple, and like correspondences is really foundational to like Kabbalah and like Western
Right.
magic. So
Right.
I was just like
Right.
curious if it was engaging.
No, it is. So it's, again, in the way that art does come to us from religion, from religious practices, but it also comes to us from occult practices. It comes from religion and magic. And that in many ways, again, the problem with modernism, is that it is tinged with romanticism. Namely, this idea that art is less than the old religion and less than the old magic. That it's sort of striving for something that it can't attain. But recall what Benjamin wrote on the mimetic faculty, right? Liquidated the power of magic without residue. Meaning, art, language, literature has the full power of religion and magic preserved in it. It's not less than. So the romantic idea is that in capitalism we somehow have less than the old people had, the ancients, with their religion and magic. No, we're far beyond them. We're far beyond the old religion and old magic, far beyond. We can do things with our own profane illumination that they could never do.
So on the one hand, he is like treating art as a commodity, but then here he's also kind of pointing beyond art, saying like to remind people that maybe they can find their own sense of like aura in life.
Well, it just is the case. So that, in other words, how is it the case? The question is not whether it's the case, but how it's the case. Right. So now again, we have this kind of paradox, we might say, with Baudelaire, or contradiction with Baudelaire, which is that he wants art to be useful. He wants it to be true to its time in capitalism. However, he also has this kind of aesthetic elitism. He does. Like, there's no doubt about that. Right. So on the one hand, his poetry is all about like everyday experience in modern life. On the other hand, it seems to be reserved to something that can only take place in this elevated domain, or this rarefied domain of art, of poetry. The question is whether that's true. In other words, it might actually be the case that, we didn't talk about this, so the commodity. So we had the little passage from Marx, the estranged labor, alienated labor. So, right, so if we're talking about a form of the value of something, then we're talking about its objectification. Also its reification, we call it a reification. Thing, turned into a thing. Labor turned into a thing. And of course, its alienation. And again, there are two sides to that. On the one hand, there's the side of it that's the bourgeois side, namely, of course, we can only realize our labor through objectifying it. So what does it mean that, on the other hand, the forms of objectification are reified and alienated, or estranged, to use the language that the translators found for the alienated labor section of the 1844 manuscripts. So, art is what it always was, namely the objectification of spirit, to use some Hegelianism, but it's also alienated in capitalism. And yet, in that alienation, it still is what it used to be. It still preserves its character as an essential objectification of spirit. So it's really the form that's the issue. And Baudelaire wants his poetry to be a commodity, a successful commodity. He wants an audience. He wants to sell books. He also wants to entertain people. He might be ambivalent about it, we could say, that okay, maybe people are reading poetry out of boredom. But we read the 1846 Salon criticism where he says the bourgeoisie need art. Why? Because they need a leisure activity. And they need, they need to relax after work. They need to relax after work. And that's as essential as anything. And so, and they need to be good. They need to be like a good form of relaxation, a good form of entertainment. They need a good leisure activity. He's basically saying, okay, I accept this criterion for art, that it should be a useful, quality, leisure time, recreation, activity, entertainment. Now, that does seem to change the status of art from like an ancient conception, and maybe even from an earlier bourgeois conception. Right, so the earlier bourgeois conception would not necessarily have counterposed the work and leisure distinction to that degree that it does now. Right, so if you spend 2/3 of your life in business, then you should spend 1/3 of your life in enjoyment, is the way he puts it. And you need quality enjoyment. You're discriminating in business, why wouldn't you be discriminating in enjoyment? Right, so again, we talked about this with Kafka and Brecht. Critical reification. So yes, there's a reification at work here. There is. But the question is, does that reification serve a critical role? Does it reveal, or does it only mystify and conceal reality? Why Brecht disliked Kafka, he thought, oh, this is like mystifying and concealing the problem of capitalism. Then he's like, no, this is revealing it. In some ways more directly than Brecht's own work did. Right? And therefore, it has a critical function. It isn't just mystifying, concealing, and thereby affirming the status quo. All right, so let's look at notes. So your notes for whose notes should I look at first? Yoko or Pablo?
Yoko.
Yoko? Okay. All right, so all right, so here we are. So I take you highlight the questions?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's a good question, but I thought in a reading, the poetry is in that time, in that era, people read poetry not for feeling, for like a culture style or something. But I think if in this generation today,
Mhm.
if someone reading poetry is, I think it's rare. Like it's not just people who read poetry right now. I think so. So like it's just person. I think it trying to feel like so. So what's the modern version? What's the today version of poetry that people enjoy just for style trend?
Good question. I don't know what's happened to poetry lately. I used to be in the poetry world, both directly and vicariously, because I myself used to write poetry for publication and deal with that whole crazy world. It's a very niche community, very niche. And then I also had a very close friend who was a much more well-established poet, kind of canonized poet, actually, of his generation. So, at the same time, there was also like the emergence of like spoken word poetry and this kind of stuff, like more performance poetry, and which me and Reginald always hated that shit. But anyway, because even though poetry is lyric and therefore really is about speech, no, it's actually become about text. It has become about something that you read on the page. That has happened. Right. So, but it's part of like the pseudo-egalitarianism of our time. Pseudo-egalitarianism, like the idea of like, well, spoken word poetry is more like the people. It's more like it's people of color. It's with the subaltern. It's like yeah, but everybody can read and write. So think about that. And also the voice of the poet. Does that have to be the actual embodied voice of the poet, or can it be the more abstracted and objectified voice of the poet on the page? Right, so I don't know. I think poetry is just like dead, basically. That's what I would put it. Like poetry is just sort of a dead genre in comparison to Baudelaire's time. Like Baudelaire, poetry was still a popular genre, whereas today it's a total niche genre. Or the poetry that we have is in the form of like popular music or something like that.
Yeah. Because I don't think poetry did. Because people who try to read the poetry is very real. They need a real feeling. They want to know what, how I describe my,
Authenticity.
Yeah.
Authenticity is a major criterion. Well, of course, it is also here in Baudelaire. Like Baudelaire, it's definitely, like authenticity is definitely a criterion in terms of experience. It's experientially authentic. That's what he was concerned with, and we haven't been concerned with it. The reason that we're concerned with it is that we're not sure what that is. Like when we think about like authentic art, or authentic literature, or authentic poetry, what would that even be? Right, so do we have that as just as a cultural criterion, or do we have it as a kind of aesthetic or style criterion? Does that even come into play? And what would it mean to say that the authentic form would be artificial? Right, would not be just sort of cultural expression, but would be about the artifice of language. What was the popular phenomenon? I feel like we had the eruption of poetry into the mass public sphere in the last few years, but I don't remember what it was now. I don't know if it was Biden's inauguration, that like a black teenage girl read a poem. Huh?
Gorman,
Who?
Amanda Gorman.
Yes. So she wrote a poem at the inauguration, yes. And, and this was to show the triumph over fascism or something, like, the defeat of Trump. By another old white guy, another angry old white guy. But this was a convincing one. But
Is that
yeah.
a poem? Is it short?
Yeah, she wrote a poem, and I feel like the, huh?
It's so amazing. I thought it was really good.
I don't know if I liked it or not. I don't quite remember it.
But she was turned into a media.
She was turned into a thing.
Yeah.
Well, inevitably, that was the whole point. That was the whole point. No, that shouldn't matter. That's right. It should be taken in its own terms, not just in terms of the political propaganda to which it was put. Yeah. Otherwise, poetry is kind of not in the public sphere, really. I don't know. Even less like even spoken word poetry was more in the public imagination, like 20 or 30 years ago than it is now. I don't know. You guys tell me. I'm like a weird academic hermit, or like I'm in the total Philistine realm of the left, which is has almost nothing to say about art at all. Nothing interesting to say about it. So I'm sort of, I need to be clued into what's going on now. Maybe there's awesome poetry happening now. Maybe. Any of you in the writing program? No. You are. But is it poetry or is it fiction? What do you look at?
I mean, I've done poetry, I made fiction, like poetry too. But I've like poetry, poetry.
Who's our poet here? Amy England? Is she still here? Maybe she's not here anymore. She was a friend of ours. Was teaching here for a while in the writing program. Is she? No. You guys don't know. You're the only one in the writing program? She might have moved on. Yeah, so poetry, the fact that poetry became like a kind of a total niche genre, I think is important. Okay, so let's move on to the experience question. Can digital or distant experiences ever become Erfahrung or only Erlebnis? Good question. With Erfahrung and Erlebnis, this isn't just to distinguish, it's also to articulate the contradiction between the active and passive aspects of experience and the idea of being an objective experience versus being a subjective experience. It gets us to a point, I don't know, I think that, the shock experience, because I know that you guys brought this up. Benjamin introduces on Baudelaire the traumatophile, that Baudelaire is a traumatophile, meaning that he seeks out traumatic experiences, which is, again, a self-contradictory thing, the idea that you'd be a traumatophile. That Baudelaire oriented himself so as to be able to register the shock of modern life, and turned himself into a sounding board for the shock of modern life. So it would seem that shock fulfills both criteria, meaning that shock turns you into a passive objective experience totally. And yet also, it's only through shock that one can have an experience that seems transformative.
This experience comes through the body in that generation. But now, the many information comes from the screen or physical, so just curious, which.
Well, here's the thing, because I feel like I'm also the generation that emphasized embodied experience and this kind of thing. Well, art is an embodied experience. It's not like reading or listening to music or looking at images. Those are embodied experiences, right? They impact you physically. They do, right? So it's not that there's something other than an embodied experience. There's only embodied experience. And so the question is how. Right? So again, the idea of virtuality, the idea that somehow there's like real experience and then there's like virtual experience is itself an interesting contradiction within experience itself. That we would even make that distinction, because what if we have all of our experience through simulated means? All right, to use Benjamin's language, the underhanded or simulated means. Right, when experience is transmitted through underhanded or simulated means. Well, what if that's all of our experience? And again, it raises the question of how could you, what's the status of the object, that therefore? In other words, if the object seems to be a virtual image rather than a physical image, and it still is a physical image. You're still looking at it with your eyes. And even if you weren't, even if they can beam these things into our brain, guess what? It's still the brain. It's still physical. Okay, we read Bergson. Right? The brain is just a circuit of matter.
I just think that when we talk about digital experiences and foreign versus urbanism, it's more of this idea that I immediately thought about Marshall McLuhan and his hot versus cold media.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our possibility of engaging or like intervening into the flux of the information, or just perceiving it passively. Yeah. So urbanism is cold media, and foreign is hot media. Yeah. Like very like in a very simplified, generalized way. Yeah.
So, hot medium is one that engages us more. That's more activating,
Yeah.
and cold medium is less so. Because I think that he even had, which now who knows how we would distinguish these things. I think that he thought that film was a hot medium and television was a cold medium.
Mm-hmm.
How can we distinguish those? Right?
How do you justify that distinguish?
The viewing experience. In other words, I guess the being at home and watching on TV versus being in the theater and watching on the big screen. Which again, it's kind of like, what would be interesting from a Benjamin perspective is that apparent contradiction, or that apparent distinction that you would rather see as a contradiction between different aspects of experience. Right. So, but again, what we talked about earlier, what if there's an experience that can only be had through the poem itself? And isn't that just as much of a virtual experience as anything? And reading it on the page, not hearing it spoken aloud. Right. So even when people try to make poetry authentic again, mappa, right? By turning it from something written on the page to something spoken, like in person. Does that make it more real, or does it only point to what we even mean by, the impactfulness or reality of poetry, the effectiveness of poetry? And what kind of effect are we trying to have? Right, so, again, maybe there's something literal, because I relate spoken word poetry to performance art. Performance art is very literal in this sense. Meaning, isn't all art performance art? All art is performance art. It's not like you literally have to have a person performing something for the art to be performative, for it to do something, for it to interact with the viewer. No. All art does that.
I think next one we will see, I think we can skip. Then the next question is
pain or wounds is a way to feel real again. Yes, obviously, this is what's going on. Right? So we have to have limit experiences in order to feel anything at all.
Pain. But there are so many pain, you know. So we need that pain for art. But this real world, many pain right now. So we need it for artificial. I don't know. And my question is, still we need a pain? I don't know.
So let's keep in mind, so if Baudelaire was a traumatophile,
Mm.
if Baudelaire was that, and he's avant-garde, he's in the forward vanguard of development historically, he's anticipating. If we're all Baudelaire now, because that's the idea, exemplary but not a model, meaning we are all Baudelaire, so it's not like Baudelaire is a model to follow, no, we already are there, then that means we're traumatophiles, right? So there's something about being a subject in capitalism that is traumatophilic. Right, so he's giving us a kind of a pure instantiation. Now, pain, let's talk about pain and pleasure. So in Kantian aesthetics, beauty is about pleasure. The sublime is about pain. The sublime is about taking pleasure in pain. Yeah. So it's the threshold. It's about like the pain that you can tolerate, and because you can tolerate it, it's pleasurable. So Baudelaire sort of flips it around and says, well, maybe beauty is the pain that we can tolerate, but maybe the only thing that's beautiful is the pain that overwhelms us. And I mean the pain that we can't tolerate, the pain that traumatizes us. That only that is the beautiful. Keep all this in mind, the surrealists are going to go there. This is going to be the surrealist deal. Right, they're going to be in search of new experiences in order to cause them new kinds of pain. And only that is beauty. Convulsive beauty, that's the term, convulsive beauty, meaning beauty has to make you convulse, which is not pleasant. And where do they get that from? They get it from Baudelaire. Hold on. Have you guys seen any Baudelaire, any good Baudelaire portraits?
Those of them.
Let's see.
It's kind of
This is
funny.
the classic one, right? This is Agar. Who did this one? Oh no. Karchak. Yeah. Actually, that one's a little soft. Hold on. I feel like there's a more like convulsive beauty, like he's literally convulsing. There's this. I actually like this, by the way. I like Courbet's portrait of Baudelaire. That's a younger Baudelaire. Oh, but the hand. The hand is amazing.
Like Egon Schiele. Great Egon Schiele.
Yeah, later though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas it's like two things at once. He's got one hand doing this and one hand doing this. So it's like the contemplative hand versus the agonized hand. Like kind of like that's a good one. The Courbet portrait of Baudelaire is actually sweet. Oh, this is maybe the one that I had in mind. No, this was also kind of soft. Sometimes there's a I don't know if it's a photo though. All right, let me put Courbet. So this is Gustave Courbet. This is his portrait of Baudelaire, and it's very sweet. It's very kind of endearing, right? And also he's kind of out of focus, but his hand is in focus. The hand is in focus, and the book is in focus, and the pen is in focus, right? So, and the pipe is in focus. Right, so he's concentrating on his smoking, his reading, his writing, and he's sort of gripped. Right? And his face is more like preceding to the. It's gonna drive me crazy. I feel like it's the cover of one of the books that we read. The cover of the Paris Spleen. Thought. And maybe that's the exact same picture, actually. Oh yeah, that's not the same photo, is it?
I don't think so.
No, it's different. Right. I think this might be an actual drawing, because of course he was depicted by people. But anyway, convulsive beauty. So the
I
beauty
think
that
there's
makes
also a Gauguin portrait of Baudelaire.
Is there?
Isn't there?
Maybe. Gauguin might be too
I
old.
think it. No, I know. But I think it. I'll look it
I believe you. Have those eyes right.
About Gauguin?
About those things, like
No.
it's not, it's not, it's too large.
About Gauguin.
up. No, I think.
Let's see.
Who's that painting, that one, right?
Oh, it looks good. Same thing that it's not. I might be wrong.
Because Gauguin's like different generation.
Yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
I just.
Baudelaire died in 1869.
Who did this, like, red, that one?
That's Courbet. Courbet is a contemporary of Baudelaire. They died around the same time. So Courbet died in the 1870s, and yeah, they're about the same age. Anyway, convulsive beauty. I thought that I was going to find my convulsive beauty. No, they all look too happy. Baudelaire looks too happy in all these pictures. This is my own psychology, I guess, children. Is that suddenly I'm seeing Baudelaire as happy. This one's kind of happy, no?
Oh, that one is kind of.
Like,
Yeah.
taking those photos.
Okay.
It's like being just like projecting your own thing.
Exactly, like it's my own state of mind somehow. Is that I always think of like the images of Baudelaire as like very like arch twisted, kind of like tormented. But these all look kind of okay. Like he's okay. He doesn't need an intervention.
I mean, it's more about Edgar Allan Poe.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Specifically-
Oh yeah, let's talk about this. Let's talk about Edgar Allan Poe. No, we won't pull up a photo of Edgar Allan Poe, but let's talk about this. Poe as a realist. Poe as a realist. Right. So we've talked about two offsprings from Romanticism: realism and modernism. So that means that realism and modernism still are romantic, still are romanticism. So what is it about Poe, who otherwise would seem to be romantic, that is nonetheless realist, and why Baudelaire would have keyed into Poe as like some kind of a model for him? Did we talk about this with the novel Psychological Realism? That's what we did, Psychological Realism. Now, so a criterion of the novel form as opposed to the epic form. So an epic doesn't require psychological realism at all, because it would never work that way. So realism in three dimensions again, namely the psychology of the character, the psychology of the reader, and the psychology of the author's voice, the text, the narrative voice, the narration. Right, so there are three individual subjects, all of whom exhibit psychological realism as a criterion: the author, the character, the reader.
This is for realism.
Well, for the bourgeois novel. For the bourgeois novel, meaning the emergence of the bourgeois novel, starting with Dante's Inferno, and then Cervantes, Don Quixote, all the way up through. Right, so, in some ways, psychological realism depends on the individual subject as the locus. And this would also be true of the lyric poem and the lyric poet. Right? That it's capturing a psychological reality that seems to be true to, again, psychology, to real psychology on the part of the poet, the reader, and the subject matter. So why do we go there? Edgar Allan Poe, because of course he does these kind of more supernatural and horror, right? Sort of, scary stories. Nonetheless, also seems to be doing social commentary. That's a criterion of Edgar Allan Poe as well. Seems to be doing societal, critical view of social situations, society, in his writing. Even when he is representing seemingly fantastical situations or events, circumstances. Again, we've naturalized a lot of this. Like, we've incorporated this generically. So, again, the authentic experience is the experience that is a shock. That's traumatizing. Not merely an experience that's affecting, like it's a sort of powerful experience, but specifically traumatizing. Again, we use that language now very unjudiciously. We just say everything's traumatizing. We're also traumatized. Right? No, like really traumatizing. So he does come back to this question of the man of the crowd, and we talked about it last week. He makes another pass of it here in the on some motifs, specifically in terms of the traumatophilic disposition, meaning the crowd is traumatizing, but it's traumatizing in a way that we have become attuned to. So we're kind of naturalized. It's natural to us. So everyday life in capitalism is full of things that would have totally overwhelmed people who came before. Totally. Like we just, in order to just live in this society, we have to deal with things that would have been traumatically overwhelming for people in the past. So again, to be true to the reality of the present, to the subject of the present, one can't just do the old genres in the same way, because it would seem inauthentic. Right, so, the flaneur is someone for whom the crowd is a spectacle, contemplated at a distance, whereas the man of the crowd is in the crowd. Now, the detective story, let's talk about the detective story genre. So the detective story genre, so Sherlock Holmes being the paradigmatic example of this, is that everyone is a potential criminal, everyone is a suspect, and everyone is a little detective. And every space is a forensic site. It's a site of forensic evidence. Right, so basically we're inhabiting a world where we're surrounded by everyone who are potential criminals, but also everyone's a detective, and in which all physical reality is forensic data in terms of crime. Or the way that Benjamin put it in his little history of photography He said that Eugene Atget photographed Paris as if it were a crime scene, and that's because every square inch of space in capitalism is a crime scene. And then we looked at Erase the Traces. The experience in poverty, Erase the Traces, correct, says Erase the Traces. So when they turn over an apartment or a house now for a new occupant, you're eliminating all forensic, hopefully you're eliminating all forensic data of the past inhabitant, right? So that now anything that you do in the apartment, you'll be leaving a trace for detectives to investigate, but no, the traces have to be erased. So that means that things have to be designed in such a way where you could do that, where you could erase the traces. Right, so you have carpeting that can be torn up, you have flooring that can be replaced, you have drywall that can be replaced. Right, everything can be turned over completely, all forensic data can be eliminated, and it could be a clean slate. You're wiping the slate clean in order to collect further forensic data. All right, so that also begins with Poe. So the detective story as the model kind of narrative in popular literature. So the TV, the police shows, the crime shows, right? But the detective story, which is new. It's a 19th century invention. And yet is really core kind of genre. Right, so it involves a particular kind of subjectivity where one is both the detective and the potential criminal. And we know these movies and these stories where people like have lost memory and then they discover that they are the criminal. No? Yes? No? There must be a Hitchcock movie version of this. There must be a Hitchcock one. Where there's a reversal, where the person, the main character is sort of investigating, and then they discover that actually it was they themselves who did the deed. Yes? So everyone's a suspect, everyone's a detective, everyone's a criminal. Right, so the man of the crowd, that anonymity of the crowd. The anonymity of the crowd as the basic foundation for social life. Right, that you become yourself precisely by losing yourself in the crowd. You become yourself by being like everyone else. This is completely different from the bourgeois ideal. The bourgeois ideal is all about individual idiosyncrasy. It's about the cultivation of one's peculiarities. It's not about, what subgenre or niche market you belong to.
But do you think this is happening today? I think it's like the opposite, though.
Yeah, everyone's got to conform
Like
to one
like
type or
in the
another.
developed world, at least, it's all about individuality.
Is it? I think it's about
Keep
conformity.
talking about your people, about it's a neoliberal.
Yeah, you a goth or you a normie or I don't even know.
Yeah, it's all about your personal identity. I mean, I understand where you're going with that, but I do think there's like this postmodern era is all about that, like regaining or reclaiming your individuality.
In a certain form. So there was definitely a mass conformity that happened in the middle of the 20th century, in Benjamin's time. And then postmodernism and neoliberalism were about like diversifying that conformity, if we can put it that way. Meaning that now there are diverse options that you can conform to. And but identity, right? The idea that identity is like a category, right? It's like what being recognized as an individual means finding a category you fit into. but can you actually be unique, different from everyone else, and still be yourself? Can we tolerate that? Can we tolerate the fact that we might not be like anyone else at all? No, that would be intolerable. In other words, you have to be able to look up your symptoms online and find that other people have experienced just what you've experienced, and that's how you become, that's how you know your experience is real, right? If no one else affirms it, then it's as if it's not real. Well, guess what? You might have an experience that no one else has ever had, and that doesn't make it any less real. Can we bear that? No, we can't. The bourgeois ethos, originally before capitalism, was very much that everyone is different. Everyone's a unique individual, and that doesn't rob the reality of the individual experience. So it's in capitalism that we get this kind of anxiety to conform. And by the way, we read Mourning and Melancholia. So I think that at the time I mentioned narcissism, that narcissism doesn't mean too full of yourself. It means empty in yourself. That's what narcissism means. It means that you need others to affirm you. That's what narcissism is. And so I guess it's a dialectical phenomenon where a person can undergo mourning only insofar as the other is real as an individual and the self is real as an individual. Otherwise, then one gets into this kind of hall of mirrors, endless spiral, downward slope. Right? And again, it's not like an individual ethos. It's not like, oh, be an individual. No, capitalism robs us of our individuality. It does. It absolutely does. It undermines the individuality that bourgeois society had liberated. And it doesn't replace it with like a traditional form either. So in traditional life, there was a relationship between the individual and the collective that people didn't feel like atomized, nor did they feel that they were conforming. Whereas we feel either that we're conforming or we're atomized. And so there's a kind of polarization of the individual and the collective. By the way, that's related to this. So I mentioned public and private, work and leisure as antinomies. They are related to this commodity form because, again, the use value, exchange value distinction would involve other distinctions like public and private, work time, leisure time, production and consumption. Right? So production, work time, leisure time, consumption. But also individual and collective. So society has always had forms of collectivity and forms of individuality. Right? All human communities ever have involved individuals and collectives. In capitalism, however, we experience this as like an antinomy. Individualism and collectivism. Atomized or completely assimilated. So it's the contradiction in the distinction that's important. The significance of the distinction is that it might express a contradiction. But it's not a mere distinction. Okay, so this gets us back to the point, which is to say that in immersing oneself into the crowd and losing oneself into the crowd, one is actually becoming isolated.
Individual alienation.
Right, that's right, that's right. So both the individuality and the collectivity in society are alienated, and that means that even if you do choose to conform, it doesn't overcome, it actually instantiates the isolation. So for Benjamin, the question is, what does Baudelaire try to do? What's his orientation? How does he try to solve the problem, if you will? And in so doing, instantiate the problem, sort of exemplify the problem. Intoxication, let's talk about that a little bit. I can. This Pablo is from last week? That's your notes from last week?
Yeah, but mine are.
Oh, you're
yeah.
also here? Okay, good.
Those are just, so it's like 5 topics, quotes, and questions for each topic. So the first I found was this: technology, mechanization, and shock. I have those 2 quotes.
Mm-hmm.
It's related to what we were talking about, the state of savagery, that is of isolation. Comfort isolates, on the other hand, it brings those enjoying it closer to mechanization. And then he talks about technology has subjected the human sensorium to a complex kind of training. And that's where he introduces the film as a form of shock, which is very interesting too.
That's right. So film, it sort of objectifies this experience of shock. Right, so the idea is that Baudelaire, like Wagner in a different way, but Baudelaire anticipates the experience of the film and tries to use an old sort of medium and genre to produce the effects that will be fully registered in film. Maybe just one thing, because you're bringing Baudelaire, let's look at one thing. I don't remember where the work of art essay is.
It's the last one.
The work of art essay is the last one in the book?
In Illuminations, yeah.
Is it? Alright, so actually that's not a bad choice on that part. I knew that it came on a little bit later. Or second to last.
Oh, second to
Yeah,
last.
second to last.
Sorry.
I was okay, let's, the last is the philosophy of history. So let's just look at the Valerie, this is a great Valerie quotation from the beginning of the work of art essay. Because it speaks to what you were talking about like the technologization of experience. So Valerie wrote, "Our fine arts were developed, their types and uses were established in times very different from the present, by men whose power of action upon things was insignificant in comparison with ours. But the amazing growth of our techniques, the adaptability and precision they have attained, the ideas and habits they are creating, make it a certainty that profound changes are impending in the ancient craft of the beautiful. In all the arts, there is a physical component which can no longer be considered or treated as it used to be, which cannot remain unaffected by our modern knowledge and power. For the last 20 years," so he's writing at the turn of the 20th century, "neither matter, nor space, nor time has been what it was from time immemorial." And I would add energy too. So neither energy, nor matter, nor space, nor time were what they were for people in the past. We must expect great innovations to transform the entire technique of the arts, thereby affecting artistic invention itself, and perhaps even bringing about an amazing change in our very notion of art. Okay, so the question is whether that has happened or not. In other words, has that been fulfilled, or has that been sort of promised but not really fulfilled? Sort of, in some way, maybe even betrayed. Right?
No, it's the other.
Right, so again, this question of technology, this is a good piece to read the Ensemble Motifs in Baudelaire as a little bit of a corrective to the work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Really, this whole course is a kind of corrective to the work of art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, because that work is so easily misread as just a celebration of film, as like, you know, a popular medium, and it's, you know, with the proletariat, etc. No, it's much more complicated. but it comes out in his other writings. So again, he's
the on some motifs that's before or after the work of art?
a year before maybe.
Because part of my reading is that it like lays the groundwork of the.
Or it
terms
might be
and
a year
concepts for the
later.
work
No,
of art.
I think this is 38, so it's 2 years after the work of art essay.
Okay.
Yeah, this is 38. The other piece was 35. The Paris and the Second Empire of Baudelaire. This is from 38, so it's written after.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is part of the Arcades project. The work of art essay was a sort of side thing that he wrote, because otherwise everything was about the Arcades project, but then he did this sort of side thing. This is a critique of Valéry, right? So one of the things that Benjamin is doing here with respect to Valéry, he's critiquing Valéry. Because in some ways, Valéry is sort of, Valéry's modernism is like sort of embracing capitalism sort of directly, whereas Baudelaire and Proust are more ambivalent about it. Right, so, yeah, in other words, the question is, can it really happen? In other words, can we adjust ourselves to the shock of modern life through technologized art? Not really, no. In other words, from Benjamin's perspective, it sort of objectifies it, it sort of gives it a form, but it doesn't it just reposes the problem in the form itself. It's not like watching film will train us to no longer be traumatized by life in capitalism. Now the reason that that's important is, again, what we were talking about earlier, art and life, the relationship between art and life. What's important is how Baudelaire tries to overcome the romantic opposition of art and life, and yet also exemplifies it. In other words, that the contradiction between art and life is sustained, it's actually presented in Baudelaire. Even though Baudelaire himself is trying to, and the question is whether he's doing it ironically or not, try to make his work into a commodity, try to make it useful, conform to the model of prostitution or the rag picker. Like, does that, okay, I'm an artist in the modern world, so I have to make modern art. Does that work, right? Does that actually work? No, it doesn't overcome the problem, it just exemplifies it. Right, so in some ways, Benjamin thinks that the problem of modernism has itself become naturalized and sort of declined since Baudelaire, so that Baudelaire's followers, you get a kind of lesser version of the same problem. Yeah, that's what he's saying about the Verlaine and Rimbaud.
And Mallarmé.
And Mallarmé and Valéry.
But Mallarmé is on the previous, of the Second Empire.
Right.
Let's say.
Right.
Yeah. This part about the hand and the factory worker is just, I don't have any questions about it, it's just that, well, I do have one. Why is Benjamin so fixated in the hand and its relation to technology? Because he talks about a lot of gestures with the hand and how hand mediates our relation to technology and thus the world. So I don't know if there's this idea of the hand and the gesture in here.
Talks a lot about gestures and crowds. Yeah. As the replacement for the integrity of language.
Right. So
But here I don't think is how I read it is that I don't think it's very metaphoric or
right.
metaphysical. It's practical. It's material. He says lighting a match, picking up a phone, gambling, operating a factory machine. Those things are done through the hand.
Right.
Technology.
So this is the important part. Okay. So we've mentioned that for Benjamin, technology is a prosthesis. It's like an artificial limb. So what's remarkable, and this is again a Marx thing, is that the automaton, the factory machine, is an objectified human action, right? So basically, it replaces a human action by imitating the human action. And the question is, can machines do things that are not just a accelerated or replaced version of a human action, but an entirely different action altogether? Right. So one of the ways that the contradiction between bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production show up in Marx, the way that that contradiction shows up is that science and technology could be used in all sorts of ways, but all that it's used for is to imitate what humans do. Right, so basically we're gonna have like a driverless car. And it's like, okay, so you're gonna have a car that drives as if a person were driving it, except you don't need a person to drive it, right? Couldn't you do other things besides that? Or can you only take a human action and sort of repeat it, make it exact, accelerate it, and that's what technology is used for, rather than being used to do something entirely different from what humans can do. Right, so in other words,
Where does Benjamin say that?
no, this is Marx.
Oh, Marx,
That's Marx.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
Das Kapital. That's Marx. Right. So that all that you have is human labor reified by technology. You don't have it like you have it replaced by technology, but actually not superseded by technology. Right. It's like the what's the robot that Elon Musk, Optimus, I guess is named after Optimus Prime in the Transformers. Because everything's like a nostalgia trip for Elon Musk. Everything is like some weird repetition from our childhood, or my generation's childhood. You know, and it's kind of like, but do we need human-like robots? Why don't we have robots that are not at all human-like whatsoever?
But wouldn't they still be doing human things? I mean, aren't these
That's what they're being
technologies-
designed for.
but
Yeah.
Technologies are human because they're doing, like, our necessities are human. So why would we make robots or technology that didn't serve human beings?
We should have the robots do things that we don't want to do and that we can't do, rather than do the things that we could do, but that society no longer needs us to do, right? But again, that's like far beyond the technology that we have in capitalism is only the technology we have in capitalism. It is not at all the possibilities of technology. It's technology is constrained and distorted and truncated by capitalism, which means by bourgeois social relations. Right? So it's basically like a robot is a person that you don't have to pay for their labor. That's all that it is. Right? But wait, couldn't the robot be something other than a person that you don't have to pay? Like, yeah, but we're not utilizing technology that way. We're utilizing it this way. Right, so that's the significance of the human act. It's the human act that's technologized, the human act that is alienated. So beyond capitalism would free both human beings and would free technology. So generally we have this antinomy that getting beyond capitalism is either going to be like liberating technology from humans or liberating humans from technology as like just one or the other. It's like, well, what if it were both? That's why I love The Matrix, by the way. The third movie, though. You have to get all the way to the third movie. Because it is about like a reconciliation of the machines and the humans where they're like doing their own thing rather than the sort of one has to win over the other. All right, but that's the way it appears. It appears like humanity versus technology, but in fact, technology is just objectified humanity. That's all that it is. Maybe that's all that will remain, but in a different form than just imitating the human that it replaces, reifying the human. Great. So that's where that comes from. That's where it comes from. Okay, we're running a little bit late. So anything we'll still be catching up a bit next week. So we only have a very short reading next time, and that's the Central Park selection from Benjamin's notes on Baudelaire for the Arcades project. Do I have any volunteers for that one? Okay. Who else? Okay, Lena. Okay. So you guys coordinate. Great. All right. Thanks, guys.